Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As tempting as it is to get into the refugee issue, I'm going to try to stay away from it, except say one thing. We've had testimony in this very hearing room, seated right where you are. Dr. Stern, in fact, was the director of the FBI who told us that there were gaps in intelligence that did not allow them to properly vet these refugees. And, of course, we should be helping the refugees. And as the chairman has said, bringing 10,000 in out of the roughly 4 million who fled Syria is a small drop in the bucket. A much larger role the United States plays is supporting these refugees as they are trying to reestablish their lives in these refugee camps. And we should and can play a huge role there, and we do. American tax dollars are used. But we do need to protect the homeland as well, and I guess that's where my questioning would be. I don't disagree with the comments about taking on ISIS in the current caliphate that they are developing in Syria and Iraq. I think we need to be more aggressive militarily, and I do think, to Professor Haeckel's comments, a military victory is an important victory outside of the military aspect because it shows that they are not invulnerable. It shows that they, in fact, can be defeated. I also, again, believe we have to protect the homeland in more effective ways, including better screening, not just for refugees. That's, of course, a very small part of the people who come here. The visa program, obviously, we had this issue arise in San Bernardino where a spousal visa was used to gain entry for one of the terrorists, and we didn't do the proper vetting, including looking at her social media, which would have been the obvious thing to do. And, of course, people coming across our borders illegally, so protecting the homeland. But to me, the most difficult part of this, and the most important part, which is why this hearing is so important, and I thank the Chair and Ranking Member for holding it, and I thank our witnesses who have provided us a lot of very valuable information, is dealing with the core issue. Some call it the hearts and minds. I don't know if that's an appropriate way to describe it, but how to keep this extremism from growing. And the jihadists who have converged in Syria come from all over the world, and we know that. We also know that attacks are occurring all over the world. We have a New York Times story from December. Some of you know this. I counted up the number of deaths from terrorism. This is not from military actions by ISIS. This is really from terrorism. It's over 1,500 people who have been killed in the last year through terrorist acts, including some we know a lot about, like Paris and San Bernardino. Others we just don't talk about much. So it's how do we get at changing the hearts and minds? Professor Haeckel, you talked about our first and best line of defense is the Muslim community. I couldn't agree with you more. And I think we don't spend enough time and effort on that. I was riding with police officers in Columbus, Ohio, over the weekend in the communities in Columbus that are Muslim communities, particularly the Somali community there. How do we encourage better communication, cooperation, to the point that we heard earlier from Dr. Miramati about separation versus, I would say, inclusion, or social alienation, I would say, versus community involvement. How do you get that interaction? I think that is incredibly important, and we're not doing enough there, and it's about domestic terrorism and the fact that we do have, even with success overseas, a problem right here at home. Dr. Vidano talked about this interest in living in a utopian Islamic society. We need to have the counter-narrative to that, obviously, much more effectively online and elsewhere. You talked about the core of the message is more important than the medium. In other words, we can complain about the fact that we do not do an effective job online, which I believe we don't, to counter it, but also we got to get at the core message as well. And then Dr. Stern had a number of interesting comments. One that I thought was most interesting is we can defeat ISIS. It'll just crop up elsewhere, essentially, what you're saying. And it's almost like whack-a-mole. You know, if we are successful in Syria, you know, I look at, again, this New York Times story and the analysis that's been done. There's at least 10 other countries where ISIS now has a presence, a huge one in Libya, for instance. And even beyond ISIS, of course, other groups will emerge because of the core. And then we also have the example from Dr. Miramati as an expert saying we're not going to bomb our way out of this problem, and talking about other ways to deal with it. So that's what I want to get at. If I could just get more ideas from you all, what should we be doing? You mentioned Egypt. There are also other Sunni countries that should be playing a more aggressive role in, as you say, exporting not Salafi jihadi Islam, but traditional Islam. What more can be done there? You mentioned, Dr. Stern, deploying former jihadists. using clerics more, the counter-narrative we talked about. If you all could, each of you give me a couple of examples of what we should be doing to address this third and I think most difficult problem we face is how to get at the core and to change those hearts and minds. And let's start with Dr. Miramati and go to our right.
So in addition to things we could do with Egypt, Morocco, Indonesia, is when I talk about helping them export, meaning materials, curriculum, books, imam training programs. So basically what the Wahhabis, what the Salafists did was they exported through this mechanism of taking over small centers, creating new centers of learning, starting at a very young age, and then establishing an imam in these centers that would then basically change the ideology of the community around them. So we need to do the reverse. We need these countries to train imams, create curriculum, and start creating that kind of groundswell around traditional pluralistic concepts of Islam. And I'm not talking about making it up on the fly. This is part of 1,200 years of Islamic history that they could draw from.
We should use our leverage, United States diplomatic leverage, economic leverage, whatever leverage we have. It's an urgent need.
Absolutely, and we're doing it. I know that, you know, our cooperation with the UAE, there's hosting conferences. Sheikh bin Baya is doing a number of events that are co-sponsored by the United States. So I know we're doing it, but I just think, I mean, Azhar University and its network graduates 400,000, has 400,000 students at any one time, 400,000 people. So that's a lot of people that could influence the way the ideological religious dynamic plays out in the next 5 to 10 years.
Dr. Donato.
Yeah, I think generally speaking, I think the U.S. has been somewhat reluctant to get into the religious debate for obvious reasons, separation of church and state. It's a religion we're not very familiar with, and I think that reluctance to some degree has to go, although we don't have to do it directly, but I think there needs to be more support for the right people, whether it's governments or even better civil society organizations abroad and domestically that work on the religious aspect of it. It's not a purely religious problem, clearly, we all agree, but there's a big religious component there. I said that maybe we sometimes overestimate the online aspect. Now I'm going to reverse what I said. And I think a lot of the message is out there. You know, you mentioned Morocco, Jordan, the UAE. A lot of these countries put out a lot of very good products, very good reinterpretation of Islamic texts that undermine ISIS interpretation, but they're not slick, they're not cool, they're not marketed in the right way. You go to these conferences and you have a lot of people with a lot of gray hair. You don't get to the right people. And often you reach those right people through social media. So it's a matter of repackaging. And I think that's a goal to have I know there's a lot of debates, conversations between the White House and Google and Facebook and so on. And I think that's one other aspect where there should be the conversation, how to repackage.
My time is expiring. I want to be courteous to our other colleagues here. So I would like, for the record, if you all, Dr. Haeckel and Dr. Stern would provide me specific examples in addition to any more that Dr. Vedino and Miramati have. But one final question. The Office of Community Partnership has come before us from the Department of Homeland Security. Are they doing what you just said, yes or no?
Yeah.
Not so much?
Not so much.
Okay.